Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram, and MeWe. And of course, be sure to visit mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
E tu ridevi. Tanto tempo fa. Era un paese diverso.
Can't stay here. Let's go. Put the kids in the car, we just go.
Well, I think what men mistake for happiness was in fact resignation and patience.
Camille, you home?
And now women are beginning to feel that patience is not the answer.
I don't think she's coming back this time.
Daddy, where have you been?
How could you not want to escape?
You keep your mouth shut, okay?
I finish here at 3. Start today? Yes?
Righto.
This is Maria. She's going to be here after school from now on.
Jack, do you cook? Ma i cimiteri australiani mi scioccavano. Tutte quelle erbacce, tutta quella dimenticanza.
Chi sta a vita? Chi sta a felicità? Un'ora per abbracciarsi e poi morire.
The kids, they're asking after you. How's Poppy Jim?
Era anche un sogno per me di scappare.
È difficile parlare di certe cose, ma uno ha trovato coraggio.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 431. Releasing May 12 in Australian cinemas is Little Tornadoes, a 1971 set drama that tells the story of Leo, a newly single father who struggles to adapt after his wife leaves him. When Maria, a recently arrived Italian immigrant, becomes a surrogate homemaker for Leo and his children, Leo must learn how to live in a new, ever-changing world. A film 10 years in the making, Little Tornadoes is a beautifully crafted and delicately told story that embraces themes universal and intimate. Little Tornadoes is also the latest film from director Aaron Wilson, who I'm glad to say joins me now on the podcast. Aaron, I thank you so very much for your time today.
Thank you, Matt, for having me.
Absolutely. You know, doing my research as I tend to do in all these kind of interview matters, it's very interesting just reading up about your movie. 10 years in the making. Part, I guess, you could say maybe an unofficial trilogy. I don't know how if there's actually a name even on it. Kind of, I wouldn't say a sequel to your debut film Canopy, but it does have narrative threads that kind of borrows over from that movie. Where did your idea for Little Tornadoes kind of come up with? What did you always have this kind of vision of this kind of trilogy mapped out, or is that something that kind of happens after Kennedy comes out and you think to yourself, you know, I think there's something more I can do with this?
It was actually a story that I had in my head from the beginning, and it wasn't necessarily a trilogy. It was originally one script for a film across 3 generations and 3 chapters. And it sort of got broken up as we went along into 3 stories because it was just quite mammoth. It would have been a 4.5, 5-hour film.
Right.
So when we were doing Canopy and Little Tornadoes shoot, we kind of shot them back to back.
Okay.
And we split Canopy off into its own film, and then we went into post-production and finished that in time for Toronto Film Festival in 2013. And then we were going to dive into finishing some filming and then post-production on what would become Little Tornadoes. And then it took a few years to find the funding and various other struggles along the way and hiccups. But what I managed to do was get back to the country where we shot the film and where I grew up every year to film little moments and textures of the film. So, for example, the harvest wasn't good when we shot the film in 2009. So I think in 2015, I went back and shot the harvest shots we now see in the film when we had a good harvest. So it was just, I guess, progressively, when I got enough money, we'd go back, we'd film some more material and put it into the film. And then my editor and I would play with it and massage and sort of see what else we needed. And that sort of got us to 2020, and we were ready to go into post-production, and that's when the pandemic struck and we got put back a little bit further. But even through that, we found ways to adapt, and at that stage we brought on Christos, and Christos was invaluable at sort of crafting the poetic narrative that is the backbone of the story. And we wouldn't have had that opportunity had we finished the film a little bit earlier. But it was always the idea of having these different chapters that all formed, I guess, a loose narrative that speaks about this regional Australian experience that begins in World War II. And we're now exploring 30 years later in 1971.
Speaking of that regional Australia, the film is set and shot in Toowoomba, I believe it's the pronunciation, New South Wales. That's your hometown, is that right?
Yeah. Toowoomba is on the Murray on the north side, and then just on the south side is Cobram. It's actually the hometown of my director of photography, Stefan Dossio. So we both grew up in that world, and we're very familiar with the landscape and the community.
When it comes to the landscape itself, when you're doing period film, and there's, you talk to your production designer, I'm sure, and costume designer and all sorts of stuff. Is there much in a way of much change to the area since you grew up in that you had to do kind of a lot of window dressing, or was there still kind of like certain things about the place that you grew up in that was so beneficial to the movie that you didn't really have to tinker around too much with it?
There are a lot of elements that haven't changed. Like the factory, for example, that we shot in, quite a few scenes, our main character works in this pump making factory, pump parts factory. And it's been there since the 40s. And the machinery has not changed since then. They're still using those same lathes and the same drills. And it looks well worn and well loved. So we basically stepped into that world. They actually said before we filmed, we've got to clean the walls for you and tidy it up. I'm like, no, don't do it.
Don't touch it. Yeah, exactly.
But, they thought, you can't show that. I'm like, no, that's life. That's texture and lived in experience. So we just stepped into some spaces like that, and we were lucky. And then other spaces, we had our production designer and our costume designer really search the town for details and textures that were around. They might have been in people's family homes or in museums or shops. But we collectively, through speaking to people in the community, found these elements and put them into the film. And then we asked some of the older generation, hey, how does this feel? Like, is this right? And they came in and offered little advice, bits of advice, and helped us tweak. And we kind of built our world that way.
Right. I want to talk about your cast. Mark Leonard Winter, who plays Leo, simply fantastic in the film. I think it's really hard, because cinema is such an expressive, performance is such an expressive thing. So when you have actors portray introverted characters, there's a fine line there and kind of like have expressive feelings, and he does a fantastic job in it. How did you know of Mark beforehand? Did you have to audition for a role? Did you write for him? Have you worked with him before? Because it's such a fantastic performance and a really well-cast performance as well.
Yeah, he's pretty wonderful. I had not worked with Mark before. I'd heard about him, but it was my wonderful casting director, Jane Norris, who suggested Mark to me. I think he was the first person that she suggested, and we auditioned a few other people, and we ended up coming back to Mark just because of the presence and just what he brought in the audition and the sort of the research and understanding he had of that character. And it was just the beginning, I guess, of it. And I thought he would be a really fascinating collaborator. So that was my reason for choosing Mark. But what was really rewarding was that when we came to film, about a month before, Mark wanted to come up and just immerse himself in that world. And he wanted to work in the factory. So we put him in touch with the owner and then the workers on the factory floor and said, go for it. So they taught him how to work the lathes, and by the end of the week, he was operating it. He was just there working and being a part of that world. And obviously he's observing all these blokes that work in this world, and it's a bizarre thing where you're working together, but you're all in isolation because you're working on your own little lathe in your own little bubble, not talking to anyone. And then we'd observe when he'd go into the lunchroom, they'd still sit in their bubbles and not say a lot. So it was just a nice social dynamic to observe. I watched that as a director, and then Mark was learning as an actor how his character might be informed by this experience. So that was really fascinating to have that be our rehearsal. And I don't like doing typical rehearsals, line reads, all that sort of stuff. I like to sort of discuss character and backstory. And I guess Mark's experience was an extension of that, just immersing himself in that world and finding his character by feel.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by 80s Tees. 80s Tees is an online retailer of licensed t-shirts and pop culture gear from your favorite movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, comic books, and musicians. Celebrate your inner 80s nerd and click on the link in the show notes below to get the Raddest retro t-shirts delivered to your door. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Loot Crate. Founded in 2012, Loot Crate is the worldwide leader in fan subscription boxes. Loot Crate partners with industry leaders in entertainment, gaming, sports, and pop culture to deliver monthly themed crates, produce interactive experiences in digital content, and film original video productions. No matter what you geek out about, Loot Crate has a subscription box for you. To get your very own exclusive collectibles, apparel, and gear delivered to your door, be sure to click on the link in the show notes below. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you love. There's a interesting thing in regards to that bubble you talked about, especially in regards to men and how they communicate or the lack of communication. Mm-hmm. These days, I'd like to believe that us as men, us as blokes, are much more open to talking about what's going on inside. I think the whole theme of mental illness is much more open now, and I think that's a really good thing as well. Back in 71, hell, back in 91, no one was really going down that lane anymore. And there's an interesting line in the movie that Maria says where she says the men don't talk here, but she makes reference to like the men in her village, why they didn't talk. They sang, they danced, they had a certain, maybe a spiritual life where they went to church and they could express their kind of things that way. When it came to that, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. When it came to that kind of aspect of it, how much of Mark's introverted nature has to do with him just being a guy in the 70s, or how much of it did it have to be being a guy in the 70s in Australia in that particular town?
Yeah, look, it's definitely the 70s and the stories I heard. And there's also elements of when I was growing up in the 80s, 90s. And there's elements of me, growing up and finding yourself in this world. It's about finding your sense of identity, I guess.
Yeah.
How you've got lots of barriers to that, and how you have to work through to find out who you are. I think also, even today, there's my brother's friends and people I know in the town. They're just blokes who get on with stuff and they don't say a lot. And yes, we do discuss things a lot more, and we're very well aware that we can talk about things more and the importance of that.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's easy to just fall back into ways unless we constantly work on ourselves or we watch out for people, just because regional Australia is so physically isolating as well. So that sort of affects the emotional isolation that can happen, particularly if little traumas pop up or, echoes of trauma that knock you about. Kind of got to constantly be on the lookout for these things because it's easy to just slip and fall into sort of bad habits. And it's interesting your comments about, is it just an Australian thing? Because I've spent quite a bit of time, particularly around our surrounding Southeast Asian region over the last 20 years for work and sort of visiting friends. But I notice in friends' families the way their father, maybe there might be a Singapore Chinese father, talking to their son, or not talking for that matter, and they show their love through food or gesture or money or something else. I really sort of saw parallels with different families, the way they operated in my family or families in my community. So I think there's ways that, father and son or grandfather and son or daughter or between husband and wife, that this dynamic, there are elements that are quite universal. And I wanted to really focus on what is universal in the family dynamic. So when trauma does affect that family unit or when troubles arise, how do they adjust and react to that or cope or not cope for that matter? Those little universal behaviours are what I was interested in this film in the context of an Australian regional physical landscape.
There's an interesting thing that happens in the film when Maria comes into Leo's home. There's a shift in tone, there's a lightness, there's a colour to it. I think it had to do, you can kind of almost smell the food that she's making. You hear the music, you just her attitude, her presence kind of brings something new to his world. Is that also symbolic of what immigration was like in that part of regional Australia as well? So, like, my background is my parents came from Croatia. They came to Australia in '69. And, it's interesting some of the things in the opening narration that Maria talks about the first time she sees kind of like Australia, and she talks about the sparseness and the silence of it. It's similar things that my parents have talked about. But they grew up in suburbia, so it's kind of different, environment-wise. But when it comes to regional Australia in kind of like what could be, I don't know, I'm just assuming certain attitudes towards the new people coming in, especially, say, Italian immigrations. I think it was more kind of like, I think I heard you said in the 80s was more Italian immigrants maybe in that part of Australia. Is that true of like a town as a whole? Is there a change in texture? Is there a change in the air when you have people that come from a different culture and they bring all of their cultural aspects to a town that might have been set in their ways for decades at that point?
Most definitely. I think small towns are like microcosms of the greater society where they're small and they, when you have a large, population that's different to who's there already, when they come in, there's great change that happens. And often in these worlds, it's the fear of the unknown. So there's racism and that sort of thing that comes up. And we explore that in the film as well. I definitely want to make sure that's very clear in the film. It's exploring the world I'm from, the problems that existed, but also the beauty that lies within all of that, which is they did bring this colour, new people coming, bringing new food and energy. And that colour is reflected in the film, the mood shifts, like you say, but also the landscape of the town, the food we eat, the sort of the culture of the town changes. And I think it's not just the Italian arrivals, it's new Australians that come. They always bring something different and fresh that is, I guess, what makes Australia really fascinating. We adjust as a country as a consequence of these new people because we're small. We don't absorb like America. We shift and change, and that's the beauty of our evolving culture. So I really wanted to focus on that component. It happens over the course of the film, but for me, it reflects how we as a country change over time. But it's also commenting on my individual experience in that town, which is maybe 50% Italian background. And you see it in the life on the street, the people, the families. There's a lot of mixed families, the food, there's a lot of orchards and tomato farms in the area. There's a lot of life and business that is a consequence of the Italians arriving and changing that landscape. So I wanted that to be in the film as well.
I think films in a lot of ways are a time capsule. They even, like, say, a period film, it's still, you're still grabbing what's happening with you personally at that time. I know I speak to directors sometimes and they might look back in their film and they don't talk about necessarily the film themselves. They talk about the memories that come from that film, the filmmaking process. What's interesting about your movie is that you shot it 10 years ago. It's coming out now. You have child actors in your movie that are teenagers now. It's just like you can see the change of time. What's it like when your actors, when your cast look back at Little Tornadoes now? What do they take from it, and what do you take from it as well? Because you've had to live with the film. You're letting it go now to go into the public. Do you look back on it? Do you see a different Aaron to what you are now? It's really interesting because the theme that I'm picking up in our conversation in the film as well is adaptation. evolution, changing with the time. What is Aaron, the Aaron back then compared to the Aaron now? And would doing this process of 10 years, was that something you might repeat again with the third entry in the film? Because it definitely is a rare and interesting way to put a movie together.
Yeah, look, I'd like to think it would take me a little bit less than 10 years to make the next film. And I've done lots of things in the middle. I direct commercials, and that gets me traveling around the world, and then also short films and other media. But the time it's taken to make this film, I've tried not to rush it. I like to say it's taken as long as it needed to have taken to make the film that we've got today. That it couldn't have happened any other way. And yes, there were frustrations along the way, but it's hard making film in Australia anyway. Yeah. So you just got to stick to the mission. Or be stubborn in my case, and just keep going, keep moving forward, and knowing that you've got a whole lot of people that have invested in you and the project, not just investors, but sponsors, actors, cast, crew, along the way, that have believed in this vision that becomes a shared vision. So you've got to really see it through, not just to completion, but now into getting it out to audiences and traveling with it and taking it on the road and doing a bit of a tour to actually engage with audiences, to talk about stories that I feel are very relevant for regional audiences across the country, but just Australians at large. That rigor, I think, is necessary, but I'm fortunate that it's happened the way it has, and we've had great people come on board to collaborate on the project.
Well, I tell everyone out there right now, when this movie comes out May 12th in Australian cinemas, you have to watch Little Tornadoes, because not only is it just a great story and great performances, but the craft of the film is really fantastic as well. From the cinematography to the sound design, which I think is very important considering the regional aspects of the film, and also that great narration, that Christos put together. I think narration can really make or break in the film, and I think in the case of Little Tornadoes, it does something really special with the movie. And Aaron, thank you so much for your time today. Congratulations for the movie. So great it's coming out now. And look, man, when that next film comes out, I can't wait to talk to you again. I hope we can do it sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Matt. I hope it's in definitely less time than 10 years. Looking forward to talking with you then.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.